Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much to coming to our Global Aviation Policy Hour. My name is Edie Lush, and I'll be here with you for the next 60 minutes. Very much look forward to our discussions. We've got some fantastic folks for you here today. We've got Dr. Abdullah over there on my left. He is the CEO of the Public Health Authority, joined by Stefano, let's see if I can do it, Baronci. Pretty good? Okay. Director General of the Airports Council International, based out in Hong Kong. And then we have Jean-Marc Bourreau, who's a partner at Consulum Aviation. And he's based in sunny Cape Verde. Very jealous of that. We also have Mohammed Rama from the International Civil Aviation Organization. And then finally, just to my left, very pleased to have Camille Al-Alwani from IATA. So, we are going to get straight into it because in the last few years, we have had so many challenges, not just COVID-19, but we've also seen 9/11, the ash cloud, geopolitical challenges around even today, and everything affects aviation, as we know, and how people and goods move around the world. So how do we get ready for what comes next and what needs to happen now at a governmental and policy level? So let's start off, first of all, with, I'm going to get all of you to answer this question. We've got an hour, but be concise. What's the one policy that you think could be implemented now that would prepare the world for the next global challenge? Dr. Abdullah.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you for the organizing committee for this wonderful forum. I think the answer for your question is reside in the question itself. I think we need to be prepared. I think the policy that we need, I think we already started, but we need also to emphasize and enforce it, is need to be prepared for the next global challenge. I'm talking from the health perspective. I guess we need to prepare about learning from the previous experience that we actually are living on, preparing by enforcing the international and national framework for health regulation. Prepared by data sharing and information about any health issue that ultimately enforce and enhance any prevention for any public health threat. Prepared by having the agility needed to adjust for any global challenge, be prepared by being innovative, ready to have the challenge, and also ultimately educate ourselves and all the folks working in the whole aviation process about any challenges.
Okay, thank you. Stefano, what about you? What's the one policy that would make us better prepared?
Well, I think to answer to this question, we really have to be in the shoes of the passengers. Passengers and actually the few ones that have decided to travel over these last 2 years compared to 2019 have encountered and continue to encounter lots of problems. Not that much in the Middle East, but certainly in a region like Asia that we represent as Airport Council International. So the key problem is to find an enabler that in the long term can be a valid tool for making sure that the passenger can experience a seamless experience. And this has to do with making sure that states can agree on a tool that can be used by the passenger. It's interoperable. And can provide
about biometrics here.
Yes, no, I'm talking about
or passport.
providing the evidence that you are ready to fly.
Okay.
In the short term, this means that you have to be vaccinated. In the short, this means for many protocols that you have to be tested, because let's not forget, still in Asia, 70% of airports require testing at departure, at arrival, or at departure only, or at arrival only. So the Middle East has done a very good job to make sure that we are approximating to the experience we had in 2019. But we are not equipped yet to have a tool that is recognized, applied, validated at multilateral level. So we need the leadership, and this has been discussed also this morning, to make sure that this happens.
Okay, great. So Jean-Marc, that's a perfect teeing you up perfectly.
I think that I'm really sorry for my fellow panelists here to the right, because I already don't have much to say after what they said. So what will they say? No, I believe that a crisis is always an opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn from what happened, and it's an opportunity that's given to us to prepare better for the future. What we see is that in this industry, in this air transport industry, between airlines, airports, health authorities, civil aviation authorities, there are many initiatives, many projects that are proposed, and excellent ideas. And many of them, of what we are talking about today, some people already had these ideas. There was not a platform that allowed the industry to implement these policies timely, fast, and in such a way that we protect the integrity and the trust of passengers. And I believe that if there is one policy that can be implemented, it's a policy that's going to integrate these initiatives and think about these from the perspective of the passengers, but in a way that's readable, that's easily accessed by passengers, instead of thinking of countries that implement one after the other more and more rules and restrictions. If we think about it from the perspective of the passenger, we can see that many of these policies from country to country are going to be similar. And if they're not similar, they can actually be categorized in a way that's readable for passengers. So if there is one policy that we need to implement, I think that it's the policy that was unveiled earlier this morning, which allows communication to be established between the different stakeholders, starting from state to state, and then allow to provide accurate, timely, precise information to all actors of the air transport industry, starting with airlines, continuing with airports, and to passengers, and to all other stakeholders of the industry.
Unveiled this morning. Great. Mohammed, what would you add?
Thank you very much, Jean-Marc, for giving me the lead for that. And I'm sure Kamel will have a lot of inputs from their airline side. But I think after 2 years now of COVID, we're still not prepared. We still cannot have confidence in the resilience of aviation for the future. Maybe the COVID situation has improved, but maybe in front of future pandemic, we still were not ready. And we have to achieve this readiness as soon as possible. So I agree with Stefano and Dr. Abdallah and Jean-Marc on the initiative that we need to have. But probably one of the initiatives that came to my mind, and I was the secretary of the task force that is formulated by the ICAO Council to work on the recovery of aviation. And I think we have established this recommendation, I think recommendation 14 of the CART work, which is recommending to states to establish specific public health corridor, even in the time of the pandemic, the heavy time of the pandemic. So where states can agree on a set of health mitigation measures, recognizing them mutually, so then they can allow people to travel between two states, either two cities or a number of cities or a number of states together. They agree on this, and I think Europe has done a good job in doing this multilateral agreement to have this public health corridor to enhance the tendency to travel without putting more restrictions on that. In ICAO, we have seen, even we have established a platform on COVID-19 where there is a tool that the states can look at this tool and try to generate what is in this arrangement between the two states. And we saw a lot of popularity for this tool. So we have more than 300 projects that has been created by states to look at establishing public health corridor with other states or with a number of states. But when we look at the implementation, it's really very, very low compared to this number. We have seen less than maybe 10 arrangements that has been done globally. So why is this paradox? Because when it comes to the implementation, the civil aviation is not in the driver's seat. Probably the health authority would be more in the driver's seat. So this brought us back to the level of coordination that has to be done on the national level. It seems that in a lot of our member states, this coordination is not going very well.
Okay.
We have recommended to states to have this Air Transport National Facilitation Committee. When we audit this standard in the states, we find only 33% of the states are having this functional and the rest are not. And even if you have this committee, is it functional? Who's in the driver's seat? This really puts a lot of pressure on the implementation. So we have to think of, in order to be ready for the future pandemic, is that we can activate and implement this public health corridor very fast and in an efficient way. Thank you.
Okay, fascinating. I remember the Honorable Minister from Malaysia, His Excellency, was telling us that life is movement, movement is life, and those corridors were real lifelines, weren't they? Kamal, what would you add from IATA perspective?
So I agree with almost everything that was said here, but we have to pause and consider one thing. First of all, I think the world didn't learn from the issues such as SARS, where we would have been better prepared for COVID. Okay, and I don't think that the world has documented how it handled COVID sufficiently to actually come up with a plan for the future just in case COVID-20 pops up. Okay, but to answer your question, I think while countries and airlines and airports struggled to reopen at various points during different variants of the virus, it got confusing for passengers, for airlines, for check-in staff. There were waiting queues up to 5-6 hours for a flight that had 120 passengers.
Right.
Documentation, they were either forged, you can't tell if they're original or not, and then if you had this document, you needed that one, and the standards changed the next day. You have to have a hotel. Did you get vaccinated? Did you do the one? And I mean, I was caught out in South Africa where I had to do a second PCR 6 hours before the flight, which I knew, and so on and so forth. That by itself shows two things. One, there's no way of having a standard document that the world accepts that shows the level of compliance with the requirements that you're going to, whether it's security requirements or medical requirements, certification. And the other one is that transfer of information globally, so that if Bob is traveling out of Bangkok, transiting into Dubai, and then ending up in Cairo, it gets really complicated for the check-in staff in Bangkok to figure out what requirements are needed. The world has mandated years ago that you have to have a passport. And then subsequently, it has to be an e-passport, i.e. a passport with a chip in it. And there's a reason for it. That chip contains the data necessary within the passport that is encrypted to the standards that the UN has actually spelled out. And when the crisis happened, everybody tried to find a way to digitize the credentials, the medical credentials to travel, okay? Because paperwork was proving to take way too long in check-in. Although everybody actually held a passport that had a chip in it, okay?
That could have held that
could have had that information.
Okay.
To me, that would have been the number one way to relieve the stress on airports, because it did get extremely stressful.
Yeah.
And number two, hooking it with applications like IATA has, which is thematic, that spews out all it's live, an application that just connects to the 193 countries and updates the requirements for each country. And this is not a new app. It's been around for 46 or 47 years. And it just tells all the airports what that passenger needs before it travels, including all the corona, the yellow fever, and so on and so forth. Okay, I think that is where aviation should focus today. That is predominantly based on the lessons learned from the past 24 months, let's say.
Okay, and even longer, in fact, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So most of the countries we know in the world are winding back the measures that they've taken. Not everyone, but most are. I wonder what you have learned in particular from what was implemented, and is there anything we should keep? Not that we want more red tape, but is there anything that was good that was implemented that we should keep? And I'll just pick on a few of you for this question. What would you say, Dr. Abdullah?
Thank you very much, Eddie. Being the health representative of this session, maybe I will be more explaining on this topic. We know for a fact that infectious disease or pandemic respect no border. So it's actually a continuous process. It's not like we turn off or turn on things about being prepared for next global challenge. I think continuing educating ourselves, the health is the responsibility for all, is not the health authority. All of us contributing in the health. So we need to continue educate ourselves, the government agency. The aviation process is a very complex process. Lots of agency folks and troops in the airline. Also educate our customer about the importance of preventive measure. We all enjoy the fact that there is a lot of sanitation is improved. The sanitizer has been displaced in the airport, in the airplanes. That's something good. It should be continue and we keep. We all enjoy the frequent cleaning and disinfecting, and all this has improved the sanitation. We should not go back from this level of, and it has also, I think, operational customer satisfaction perspective.
I don't think I need any more small bottles of hand sanitizer given to me, though.
Yeah, you may, but at least the appearance of having this sanitizer absolutely improving. Advocating for keeping the mask in the crowded or area. I think it might be kept on, and in general health advice. So you need to have a very healthy people working in the aviation process. Less smoking or no smoking.
Right.
Healthy diet, better choices, the healthy choices that ultimately improve I think we should keep.
Sure. Okay, great. What about, did you want to add something, Stefano? Yeah.
I think that the real lessons or good things that we achieved is the multidisciplinarity of the exercise, meaning we were forced to communicate to a degree that we were not used to in the past. So of course, airports, airlines have to apply measures, requirements that have to do with health, and that was also before COVID. But the level and degree and complexity of the risk implied an extra effort. Now, this is a great lesson for the future. The thing is that now we have to do a further step, and has to do with your first question, meaning we need a top-down more than a bottom-up approach.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, again, at regional level, things have done in the Middle East, through ASEAN, in Asia. The European Union had a very difficult and complex challenge to put together states that at the end of the day, as in any other regions of the world, have the final voice on what measure to apply. And this is where the complexities start, because the WHO comes with recommendations, has been quick to do so. Sometimes it was difficult to interpret it from a passenger perspective, again. But states can decide what measures to apply based on their risk assessment, based on their capacity to respond to the problem. And we have to respect that, as much as we have to continue to follow the science. The issue is that now we need a top-down approach, because next time the virus may have a profile which is very different from the ones that we experienced through the Omicron. Now, we learned that wearing a mask or changing the air is probably much more important than the social distancing.
Right.
But from an operational perspective, social distancing is a very complex measure to implement.
Especially on an airplane. Yeah, okay.
But also at the airport.
But not exactly. So I'll give one more person an opportunity to talk about this. What policies do you think we should keep? Mohammed, do you want to have a go?
Thank you very much, Eddie. I think the severity of this crisis has made us really come together. Stefano has mentioned this, and it's really very critical that we work together. And I remember during the very severe days of the COVID, in April 2020, in 18th of April 2020, international traffic came almost to zero.
Yeah.
So the world come to a standstill situation. Nobody's moving. It was very scary at that time. And this makes us and ICAO provide a platform for everyone to work together. And I have to recognize here the presence of the chair of the CART, the Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, Ambassador Esono. Thank you, Ambassador Esono, for your leadership. Where everyone from the industry side, from the UN organizations, from the regional organizations, we came together, we sat together in order to find a way out. Because as the Minister, His Excellency, the Minister of Transport said today, this morning in his opening, recovery cannot achieved by single one entity. Everyone has to work together. So what we need to keep for the future, and maybe to build more resilience for the future, is to keep working together with the same pace and come quickly together without any formalities, because formalities take time.
Yeah.
Now we have this mechanism where the CART is not like the council and the official, it's unofficial mechanism where everyone can sit together in one room, and we were using Zoom at that time. So just by a simple click of a button, we sit together and we discuss, and we need to keep this spirit of working together. Because if we work alone, even we're representing 193 states, but then the voices of the industries and the operators are not heard. And if we work on silos, definitely the recommendation will be a joke, because it doesn't have any operational consideration, which is not really the case. And we have to remember that the situation during COVID were changing day by day. So if we didn't have this quick and agile feedback, we wouldn't be able to amend the recommendations or ask states to do different measures month by month.
Right.
So we need to keep working together with the same
Okay,
spirit.
we'll come back to that issue around partnerships. And of course, one person's rules and regulations are another person's red tape. And so I wonder, are there any policies that are now just out of date that we need to jettison, or that we need to update, Jean-Marc?
Yes, Eddie, absolutely. I believe that the future solutions. Just one element for consideration. What we are facing here, is this a technical issue or is this a political issue? And let me share the following to see what our audience thinks about that. We are little by little getting out of the current crisis. I mean, we haven't eradicated this virus, but we keep on living. And traffic in certain areas of the world is already at close to or beyond 2019 levels, correct? In the US, internally in Europe, in some other areas of the world, within China until a few weeks ago. And the rest of the world, international traffic, is still below 40, 50, 60% in some areas of the world. So why is that? And my take at it is that when you are working within a space, within one country or a group of countries that has aligned its policies, its regulations, people do fly because we are taking the risk out of the equation, we are taking the uncertainty out of the equation for passengers. So now let's think 1 second that we are actually working on a policy to harmonize requirements for air travel across countries. Would we still be down 40 or 60%? Or would we already be back up where we were and maybe above? So if from this story you allow me, maybe it's to jump to a conclusion. I don't want that, I don't like that, but let's imagine 1 second that this might be actually the way to go, then the answer to get out of this crisis becomes political. And if it becomes political, we can solve it through a policy that is approved by the different member states of ICAO with the support of the health authorities in coordination with the different industry players. And this is, I believe, how we can build this resilience in the system and be ready for next time, by having this communication tool, this platform that will allow us to be much faster at aligning the different regulations in different countries.
Okay, thank you very much. Camille, what would you add? Anything we need to get rid of or really update? What policy?
So I agree actually with what Mohammed and John Paul put together. If you've read the document, the CART, ICAO CART document, the number of entities that were involved, it's an amazing document. It came out, the first version came out relatively quickly, and then we're I think on CART 3 now, and it's a document. So if we want to keep something, it should be that document. We should keep that document alive and update and so on. It's a standard. It's not a rule or anything. It's just a standard that states should be looking at to adopt. So if I want to answer the question, because there's so many variables here, okay, the actual answer is I'd like to keep CART going alive and updated as best as can, and dump everything that contradicts CART.
Okay.
Get rid of all these restrictions and homegrown remedies and so on and so forth from state to state. Get rid of that and just simply adopt the CART.
Okay, great. Yeah. How easy is that?
It's relatively easy. It's a beautiful document. It's relatively easy. To me, and I'm going to be extremely frank here, okay, aviation is the most regulated industry in the world.
Yeah.
The regulations are huge, okay? So states expect ICAO to develop the standards that the states have to apply to uniform the standards across planet Earth. And then the state itself hands over that responsibility to do with everything in aviation to usually the Civil Aviation Authority, okay? And that's how it works. And then any entity that works in aviation has to be authorized by and oversighted by that Civil Aviation Authority. And you can see it over the history of aviation in the last 100 years. That's how it's been working,
okay,
except this incident. This is where non-aviation people were making decisions about aviation without consulting aviation.
Right.
Okay, and this is why I say get back to CART, because CART then tries to explain to non-aviation people, this is what you need to do, okay, in line with your aviation industry, whether it's a civil aviation, the airport, the airline,
okay,
on how to move forwards.
Stefano, did you want to come in?
Very interesting story told by the courageous, brave girl that flew across the world.
Yeah.
Told us a very interesting point. She said, if I remember well, that if I got it well, that the most important showstopper was not the weather, but was the expiration of the visa to go to Russia.
Right.
So it took her 1 month to get it. So it tells you how much it can be complicated to travel. Now, of course, there are rules that we have to respect. I'm not saying that this is unavoidable, but at the same time, there are ways to learn to make the system simpler.
Okay, great. I'm going to come to a question of partnerships in a moment, but Mohammed, did you want to come in?
Definitely, Camille has intrigued me into getting into this, because an Ambassador Sono remembers the discussion we have in ICAO and ICAO Council. Is CART a recommendation or a standard practice? You know, ICAO as an organization, by the way, is meant to be slow. We're not slow by nature, but we're meant to be slow to give the states time to implement. Because if you are very fast coming with standards,
right,
state will struggle to implement, and then they will be audited, and then it's another challenge for the states. And when we think of international standards, we have to think of the capabilities not only for some states, but for 193 states with different levels of resources. So we had this discussion with Ambassador Isono, and is the recommendation of CART is mandatory, or it's up to the states to implement? Even when we have the high-level conference, and the high-level conference in 2021 in October has been attended by more than 60 ministers, 60 air transport ministers, and the declaration was adopted. But yet the challenge is to get consensus on this is like a mandatory standards or a recommendation.
right.
We couldn't get into the mandatory standard side, and it's still a recommendation. Yet, The way we do through our 7 regional offices globally is try to follow up with the states on the implementation level. But unfortunately, some of the states are providing information that might not be very accurate. And let's be honest with that. Because they thought that this platform is seen all over the world and they have to look better, which is not helping really the implementation level. So what I recommend here to our member states is that to give us the real feedback from the ground. Sometimes we say that this recommendation has been implemented 70 or 80%, but when we look at the operation side, we see that still low. So there might be a little bit of optimism in reporting on the implementation, but the reality says we're still at a very low implementation level.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to give our health representative a moment to come back, because all of this, all that we've seen that has been innovative over the last few years has really come because of partnerships between organizations, between different government entities, between public and private. So I wonder if you can give me a really good example of that partnership that you've seen in policy terms and how you've been collaborating with others.
That's a very good question. During the pandemic, we issued more than 250 protocols and guide for all the sector, including aviation, industry, education, commerce. All these aspects we issue it together, and we work with the multi-sectoral approach with all the entities. We divide our approach in 3 stages. The stage 1 is understanding the process with the right stakeholder. Try to understand the process and look for the best practice, developing the protocol and the guide together with them, knowing from them what's the best and how can they be with us in the developing of this protocol, from the aviation, from all the stakeholder in that process. And the third approach, the third element actually is implementing this guide with the monitoring aspect and try to rapidly correct any issue happened during this process. 250 more than 250 in different stakeholder, and it was continuous meetings, checking on that, and rapidly changing and being agile to accommodate any feedback from any sector. So I think the key successful of at least in Saudi Arabia, key sector is actually the level of collaboration was phenomenal. Everybody was contributing at their best. Everybody working toward one goal, and that I think give us a great example, a story to tell. I think we need to capitalize on that. Thank you.
Great. Jean-Marc, what about the partnerships that you've been involved with in order to make this policy that you've been working so hard come to light?
You see, we are coming from the air transport industry, and I believe that partnerships are fantastic. I mean, this is the way to go. But to solve problems, we need to recognize that partnerships take time to implement. If we want to actually be able to answer to an emergency, we don't have time. We all know that in aviation. What's critical when you have something happening at your airport, your standard is that you must be to the end of each runway in less than 3 minutes, and the recommendation is less than 2 minutes. When something happens, you don't have time to think. You need to be there and apply a protocol that's pre-established. So in terms of partnerships, I believe that what's fundamental is to have some kind of emergency manual that we already have at each of our airports. Every airline has an emergency manual. When there is an emergency at an airline, nobody's thinking about partnerships that they need. They just go to the emergency manual, go for it, done. When you're at an airport, when there is an emergency, you don't think. You apply your emergency manual, done. When we have an emergency, a global emergency such as a health crisis, we start saying that, oh, we need to collaborate. No, we need to have this emergency manual in place. And this emergency manual has not been written yet. And this is the ambition of this policy that we have been discussing here. And it's really comforting to see that stakeholders are on board, or, there is work to do. It's a lot of work to do, because putting an emergency manual for an airport or an airline is a lot of work. Putting an emergency manual for our planet, for our aviation system, is a huge undertaking. But we need to start with communication, knowing each other, have clear goals, and then we can go for it. So,
okay, great. Collaboration, Camille?
I think if you want to fix something, I always divide it into 4 columns, each worth 25%. The first column is admitting that there's something wrong. The second one is identifying what's wrong, and that's 50% of the problem solved. Next is coming up with a plan to solve it, and the third is actually implementing the plan. But we have to take the first one before we move to the next column, which is actually admitting that there's something wrong. In my view, I think the pandemic showed that there are massive disconnects in each state, or collaboratively in each continent, or globally. And I think if we don't address that issue, we're never going to be ready for the next pandemic. And the fact remains is that there are entities that are used to working together. ICAO and IATA are brother and brother. Okay, WHO played a big role in CART. ACI is also a partner. Airlines are partners in all this. Okay, it's the new players that came in when the pandemic first started, and I don't blame. So the Ministry of Health in every country. I'm not singling out a country. You can imagine when they opened CNN in March and they saw, dead bodies lying in the streets in Italy, and the fear factor alone would justify the actions each state took in March of 2020. There's no dispute about that. April, the same. May, it started to get a little clearer. June, there was science behind what they were discovering. July, it was what they know in July is what we know today.
Right.
So what happened from July till recently, before aviation opened up, and the aviation industry got control of its industry again. And that's why the standard collaboration, which is usually the civil aviations with ICAO, the airlines with IATA, all working together in a mishmash of thousands of issues, that's been going on for 100 years. It's the new players that came in because of the virus that demonstrated that there was no collaboration. It was a one-way road. You do it this way. We've been given the command to make the decisions, regardless of at what cost. Okay, and this is the first, to me, that identifying what the problem is, admitting it's a problem before we can move forwards.
Okay. Stefano, what would you add here?
I try to summarize what just Camille said with one word: proportionality. So you need to react to a risk with a measure that address this risk without overreacting to it. Now, one of the lessons that we learned over these 2 years, according, of course, to the profile of risk that we have encountered, is that the virus was always quicker than the legislation, than the measure applied. So as soon as let's say a barrier, a wall was set, a protocol was introduced, the virus was already in the community, spreading silently. Now, the conclusions to this was, by the authorities, including the health authority, that it was disproportionate to expect the border to be the strictest area, geographical area, to apply these measures. And so it took probably too long to some countries to relax the measure. And this is, let me say, a typical behavior of legislators. They introduce rules, but it takes always long to withdraw them. So we need to learn from the past to profile the risk and apply the right measures. That being said, I have to say, in favor of my colleague here, that it's been a very unique experience. And there were considerations that had to be taken into account that goes well beyond the scope in which my colleagues on the right side operate. So we have to take that into account.
You want to give an example there?
An example
Yeah.
about, well, it's basically the fact that you need to guarantee the health of the people.
Right.
If the composition of your population is made of elderly people, if these people are not fully vaccinated or not, the risk is higher.
Yeah.
So again, it's a minimum common denominator can be identified, but then there are variances that we have to respect based on their evaluation.
Okay, great. Mohammed.
Thank you, Eddie. I think, if we can ask ourselves a question today, did the states who really implement border restrictions get less cases infected? In my personal point of view, it's not. States who had really implement closure, they still suffer from a high number of cases. This is one. The second thing is that talking about partnership, sometimes within the UN we have different mandates, but yet we can find common ground to collaborate and make things better. Just to give you an example, in civil aviation, of course, our mandate is to ensure the safe and secure operation of aviation. In World Tourism Organization, of course, they are supporting the opening of borders and increase the travel capabilities of passengers in order to promote tourism. More than 50% of people going to tourism use aircrafts. But WHO, they have probably different mandate, is how to restrict the spread of the virus. So we're working in two different directions, but yet through partnership, we can find common grounds where we can collaborate to make things better. And I remember the discussions that we had with WHO. At the beginning, it was very difficult to reach this consensus. But after a while, because even WHO were suffering from fewer operations that transport vaccines to other parts of the world.
Right.
So can you imagine the need
Right.
to open up borders? So then we find the common ground that we can work together, make the recommendations to the health authorities, not contradicting with our recommendations in ICAO to the civil aviation authorities.
Yeah.
At least we can talk the same language and give recommendations that are not contradicting to each party. Again, this comes to the partnership within each state. If the internal discussion at the state level is not up to the level, definitely we will have unilateral decisions that are not based on the risk-based methodology that we recommend within CART. So partnership is a great thing. I do agree with Jean-Marc that we need to have this preparedness ready, and I think the discussion in the council right now is how to build resilience through having this mechanism of emergency response that is quick, that is really very well-defined processes in order to be sure that we are more resilient in front of future pandemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Well, I know that time is drawing to a close, and I'm going to get a sign from a moment in it. Can't even see that, but maybe you can. 5, right. Okay, so what I want you to imagine is this is your group that can put whatever you want to say into action. So we have an incredible group of people from government, we have entrepreneurs, we have folks from business. What do you need from them? What's your call to action that would make what you want to do achievable? Dr. Abdullah.
Well, I just want to say that health is part of every aspect of our life, whether in any industry, regardless of its complexity. And I want to make sure that everybody know that with collaboration and working with a partnership and keeping yourself safe and healthy and your colleagues safe and healthy will ultimately will have a prosperous industry in any aspect.
Okay, we'll come over to you, Camille.
I think it's a good question, to be honest, and I think if I had the aviation industry or people related to, so whether it's custom control and security in airports and so on, all online, I think the first issue is that we should review what happened in the last, during the COVID and start drawing up a plan to be more ready to handle the next crisis. But the other one is, I think that if anything, Spending 5 hours in an airport trying to check into a flight with 200 passengers on top of each other.
Never again.
Yeah, spread COVID more than anything else. Okay?
Right.
So I think it's time that passports are digitalized. The process of barometrics being used in airports to check in quickly. What is the problem in going to the check-in desk, putting your thumbprint and identifying who you are, dropping off your bag and walking away? Literally, why are we not? The technology's been around for a while. Why have we not been able to get governments to work with each other, relieve or work with the entities inside, because there's many entities, predominantly the police, the airport, and so on, to make this travel for the passenger from A to Z straightforward.
Fine.
Airlines can only push a certain amount before they start hitting, red tape everywhere. And had we been prepared from SARS, it would have been, we could have been traveling. There shouldn't have been the shutdown of aviation for 3 or 4 months, and everything should have been continuing, but safely.
Okay, biometrics, digitalized. Stefano, from the airport perspective, what's your call to action?
We have never mentioned existential threats such as environment, such as economics, social development. It gives you a sense of how is important to sort out the problems that we have shared. And I leave you with this.
Okay, thank you. Mohammed.
I think a lot has been said, but what we need to focus on in the near future is to build mutual trust in the health certificates. Why states are applying restrictions? Because mainly they don't trust health certificates issued by other states. This is a very fundamental issue that we need to resolve. If the states would have enough confidence in either vaccine certificates or testing certificates that are issued across border, there will be less tendency to close the borders. So we need to work collectively, and probably ICAO is well positioned to do this collaboration between everyone and all stakeholders in aviation to make sure that we build this system of building more confidence in the health certificates. If we manage to do this, not for the COVID-19, but probably for future pandemics as well, we will be in a very good shape, and we will be less frightened of any health emergency that happens. The other thing is that we have to think that this is the worst crisis ever that aviation has faced in all aviation history, and the longest. So, and it's global. So this global crisis doesn't need at all a national or regional solution. It needs a global solution. Because without a global solution, we will keep struggling. Even if we manage to fly domestically or regionally, still, we are not giving people the liberty to move. And this is one essential right of human beings. We need to give them the freedom to move. And to give them this freedom, we have to come to a global framework. And I think ICAO is well positioned to do this.
Thank you. All right, Jean-Marc, last word. What's your call to the audience, your message for them?
My message is very simple. This morning, His Excellency, the President of GACA, unveiled the proposal of the harmonization of air travel policy. This policy is aimed at offering a solution to what we have just discussed today. This is a proposal that means that all the members of this fantastic assembly here are absolutely welcome to enhance, propose, comment on that policy in such a way that we can finalize this work and make it a document that will be presented at the General Assembly of ICAO in September. And hopefully it can be adopted in September, and we can then continue with its implementation as a contribution to more resilience for our industry.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like you, the audience, to thank you for your time, but I'd like you to help me in thanking my fantastic panel in this wonderful policy hour. Let's give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll see you back in the plenary in a few minutes. Or no, another gate. You can go to another gate now, can't you?
Very good. Well, welcome everyone and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us to discuss the topic of novel aviation fuels. While this particular session has a fairly narrow scope, as I've listened to other sessions throughout the day, it strikes me that virtually every session has had a diversion into the topic of sustainability, as is probably appropriate. We'll be coming back to this tomorrow with a much broader lens. But today, and you'll understand when you see our panelists as to why we're focused on the topic of fuels, we're going to stay relatively narrow. Let me introduce our panel quickly. I'll start with a few slides just to set the stage for the conversation. I'll have some questions for the panelists after each one of them makes some introductory remarks, and then we'll open it up to you as you may have things on your minds. So joining us today, first of all, is John Kelly from Rolls-Royce. I believe you go by JK. If anyone in the audience wants to introduce you, that'll be a popular theme you'll see. Richard Forson, who is the CEO of Cargolux. Certainly you burn a fair amount of aviation fuel every day. By the way, prior to joining McKinsey, I was an airline pilot, so I've earned my share. We have Alexandre Ziegler from Safran, and we have Tamour Javed from Aramco, and Jean-Christophe Montfort, also from Aramco, and again, I think you go by JC. Yes. Is that correct? Yes. So I'm Alex Dichter. I lead the global aviation and travel practice for McKinsey & Company. I've done that for the last 20 years or so. I've been at McKinsey for 24 years. All of that time in and around aviation. As those of you who are in the industry know, it gets into your blood and it's a little bit hard to shake. And as I mentioned, I burned my fair share of Jet A in my day as an airline pilot. Let me bring our slides up, and I'm just going to share a few slides to set the stage for the discussion. The first one, and my team built these slides, and I'm not sure whether they were trying to be sarcastic with the headline when they said, let's start with some good news. I suppose what they meant was that the good news is that the industry has coalesced around an ambitious target, which is to be net zero by 2050. That is indeed, I think, good news for the future of the planet, for our children, for our grandchildren. I think the bad news is, and several panelists throughout the day have said this is going to be a very difficult target to reach. This is one of the hardest to abate sectors. Physics is very much working against us in every way. The act of flying 300 passengers 15 hours is already a miracle in many ways. And to do it through another means besides petrochemicals is a miracle cubed. We have 1.8 gigatons that would need to be abated in 2050. That's just 1 year. And that's a cumulative abatement of 21.2. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the metrics of carbon abatement, let's just say that that's a lot. And last but not least this is not an industry that's standing still. Forecasts from Boeing and Airbus, and of course many that track the industry, suggest that as we come out of COVID, we're going to go back to a relatively healthy growth rate. Much of that growth will come from emerging markets. And so we'll see 10 billion people flying by 2050, more than, about the world's population at that point. And so we're chasing a moving target. This is not going to be easy. And I think we as an industry, I would, as both an insider and an observer, I'd commend us for setting the target. I'd probably criticize us for leaving the world with the impression that we're going to get there linearly. Because as anyone that studies this knows, that is impossible. And I think part of our dialogue around sustainability has to be in setting expectations about the fact that if we make it, it's going to look like this. And that there's going to be a phase of experimentation and learning, and we're in that phase now, of proving that these technologies are possible, and then a point at which they start to come into scale and really start to make a difference. But that's going to take a while. And of course, if we look at the technologies that you see talked about in the newspaper, and of course many both on the panel and elsewhere are investing in, it's quite clear to anyone, again, trained in the laws of physics, that sustainable aviation fuels has to be a significant, if not the majority, of the answer between now and 2050. And so if we look at pure electrification or hydrogen fuel cell, this is technology that might be applied to relatively small aircraft, 19 seats or fewer, and by the way, could come into view relatively soon. But But even this is an ambitious frame. In the regional market, we might see electric coming into view by 2030. Again, this is when the technology is ready. Now, remember that to launch a new aircraft, particularly one based on new technology, is a 10-year or so development cycle. It's then 15 years before the deliveries of that aircraft start to make a real dent, in the industry mix and start to contribute to decarbonization. And if we look at short haul, medium haul, and long haul, again, the physical challenges dictate that SAF has to be the majority of the answer over the course of the period between now and 2050. And my personal view is that the estimates on the timeline here are extraordinarily ambitious in terms of when either pure hydrogen or pure electrification could really make a real difference, again, based on the timeline to develop new aircraft. And of course, if we focus on SAF, it comes today, as far as we know, from 4 different sources. You have HEFA, which is SAF made from waste, so cooking oils and things like that. And the good news about HEFA is the technology is relatively mature. We know how to produce it. It comes at a cost premium, but it's a cost premium that we understand. The bad news is that we run out of feedstock pretty quickly unless the world shifts its entire diet to French fries, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. So maybe 10% of the world's needs could be satisfied by HEFA feedstocks, and certainly that's not enough. Alcohol to jet and gasification are technologies that work with biomass. And biomass exists in all forms. It can be scraps of dead plant material on the forest floor. It can be algae. It can be things that we currently grow today as food stocks, like sugarcane. And of course, the good news about biomass is it's very renewable. There's a lot of it. The bad news is it's either very difficult to collect, material on the forest floor, for instance, or it has competing uses. And so while we all want to solve the problem of the industry's carbon footprint, none of us want to read about rising food prices in emerging markets as a second-order consequence of the Western world being able to fly more. And of course, gasification is a process that takes biomass and turns it into gas by combining hydrogen and oxygen together. It takes an enormous amount of energy. And so there are complications with using biomass. There are solvable complications, but we don't yet have a very clear path to scale that technology. And probably the most exciting technology in the long run is what is often referred to as power to liquids. And this is the process of combining carbon dioxide and hydrogen and an enormous amount of electricity into a synthetic aviation fuel. And the good news there is that the feedstocks are unlimited and renewable. The bad news is that it requires an enormous amount of electricity. And just to give you a soundbite, if you were interested in, to supply, I think the number was 2% of a typical large European airline's annual jet fuel needs with power to liquid-based fuels. And to generate that electricity from solar, you'd need to cover all of Manhattan with solar panels. And so that sounds daunting. On the other hand, there are other avenues. And so there are places in the world where we have unlimited space. And of course, there are other ways to get relatively inexpensive and relatively green electricity. But the simple answer is, other than HEFA, which has limited supply, the path to scalability is not clear on any one of these technologies. And the price, as it stands today, is a significant premium to petroleum-based jet. Or at least a significant premium to petroleum-based jet as we knew it in 2019, bearing in mind that prices per gallon at Pad 1, which is the northeast distribution point in the United States, hit $7.50 per gallon 3.5 weeks ago. And so that's probably hunting around where SAF would be in some of these more cutting-edge technologies. And of course, with everyone talking about SAF and increasingly understanding that SAF is the main source through which we will reach our 2050 goals, the real risk, and perhaps I'd characterize it as a certainty, is that demand outstrips supply. And we all know what happens when demand outstrips supply is that whatever the natural cost curve is for SAF, which is already a premium to jet, may be multiplied by supply-demand dynamics and could be multiplied dramatically. And of course, one thing that many in the industry are worried about, including McKinsey, by the way, we're one of the largest travel accounts in the world, and so we're also interested in buying SAF, is that we end up with a zero-sum game of everyone trying to solve their own problem, where at the end of the day, there is only one problem, and it is a problem for the planet. Of course, the good news is that we do see a reasonable amount of diversification of bets. And so this is a complicated map to read, but each one of the bubbles represents a production quantity. The color is the technology that is at play. And so certainly you'll see a lot more light blue dots than you see anything else. That's HEFA. But we're starting to see early stage power to liquid investments, early stage gasification investments, early stage biomass investments, which suggest a diversification of feedstock sources and processes, which of course is precisely what we need to see. But the bottom line is, to get to a 2050 or even a 2030 target, we're going to have to do a bit of everything at once. And so this is, sort of what a typical airline might look at, and that's, there's growth until 2030. There's a renewal of the fleet, which helps certainly. There's the normal process of burning less fuel. By the way, IATA has something like 53 levers, if I remember correctly, to reduce fuel burn on aircraft. I'd say the average airline is probably tapping into, no more than 25 or 30% of that opportunity. And certainly it was raised earlier today that one of the biggest opportunities in the burn less fuel category is modernization and depoliticization of air traffic control. And I think we all in the industry have a responsibility to do our part, but also to hold governments accountable for what they can do, and that's certainly one thing. That gets us to a nice reduction, but still way ahead of where the industry would need to be by 2030. And then you have CORSIA, which is mostly offsets, and you've got voluntary decarbonization. That can get us to a 2030 target, it can get us to a 2050 target, but those don't, for the moment, count as science-based targets. And so that leaves us somewhat unfulfilled about the path. And then I suppose the last thing I'd say before we hand over to our panelists is that on the question of SAF, there are two frames. One frame is, look, when we paint the investments that are being made today, and we look at the feedstock maturation, we are going to be nowhere near where we need to be. We are going to have demand outstripping supply. That is going to drive prices through the roof. And we need to start thinking about how we allocate SAF in a way that makes this a single problem versus a competitive problem. Otherwise, we're going to have an economic problem on top of a carbon problem. And the other frame is that, like any industry, industries are efficient, and with the demand signals will come more investment, and with more investment comes more supply. And the only challenge is to meter those things out. I'd say the good news is everyone is now talking about this. I exchanged notes with my fellow panelists, and I think each of us have probably had a dozen speaking invitations over the course of the last month, and more coming. But that's also part of the problem, with multiple convening bodies trying to own the task of getting everyone aligned with a plan. At some point, we are going to have to make some choices. But with that, I'm going to hand over to our panelists to each say a few remarks, and let me frame at the highest level. There are really only two questions here, although I will ask multiple flavors of those questions. Question one is, where are we going to get it? And question two is, how are we going to pay for it? And so with that, I'll hand over to JK, and why don't you start and share a little bit about how Rolls-Royce is thinking about it.
Thank you, Alex. So the Rolls-Royce sustainability strategy relies on three main pillars. The first is to ever improve the efficiency of the gas turbine. Your charts eloquently show that, certainly for medium, long-haul, wide-body flying, gas turbines in combination with SAF are the way to provide that propulsion, certainly in the foreseeable future. So everything we can do to improve the efficiency of the gas turbine saves the fuel. It will save it whether it's Jet A, it will save it whether it's SAF. So that's our direct accountability, that's our direct contribution. As well as today's world's most efficient engine, the Trent XWB, we're taking that one step further with a new product called the UltraFan, which will offer 25% improvement relative to the first Trent, which we see as a big game changer that we can provide. If you then move to the second pillar, which is to combine that technology with SAF, with sustainable aviation fuels, you are significantly driving down the carbon output from long-haul flight. Certainly, as we recover and we return to growth in the industry, one thing is clear: the public want to fly. People wish to fly. They wish to connect. You can see through attendances at forums like this, people want to fly. People want to fly cargo, such as Richard. So whatever we can do in that space, and for us, we don't produce SAF, but we certainly want to collaborate. I would say we want to collaborate for action. We have to drive through targets. We were very welcoming of the IATA targets announced in Boston at the AGM last year, that they provide a good pathway. So our commitment here is twofold. One is we have tested and will continue to test all of our products to prove 100% that they can fly on 100% SAF safely. And that includes metering the fuel, getting it to site. We're driving actually for all of our engine testing at our facilities to run on SAF as well. But the real key bit for SAF for us is to collaborate across the industry, as per my fellow panel members, to work out which of those pathways are the right way forwards. But fundamentally, it comes down to your key point. It's about scalability, it's about price point. And I'm sure we'll explore that more through the questions. The third pillar is those radical technologies to explore electrification of flight and other sources such as hydrogen. So we are very much invested in exploring those. Our perspective is there is no one silver bullet solution. We have to keep across the board solution and keep an open mind. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Richard, Cargolux, I imagine, is particularly with the shutdown of part of the world's cargo industry, the largest pure play cargo operator in the world. And while cargo carbon footprint hasn't had as much attention in recent past, I'm sure it's coming. And of course, you're based in Europe. How is Cargolux thinking about these challenges?
Well, from Cargolux perspective, obviously as an industry, together with our passenger colleagues, I think we aim to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. But the biggest question is that there is no blueprint that exists today. It's a global problem brought about by global warming, but there's no global solution. Everybody's going off on their own, instead of coming together and say, listen, we do have this problem, but we have not been able to achieve that as a planet. There are always disagreements. People put economic growth before looking at reducing the impact on the environment, etc. So until we get to that stage, we are going to struggle along. You have various parties in the world that are all trying new technologies, as you spoke about. HEFA is the most mature technology. That is currently what we're buying today from the market at a significant premium over jet fuel. As things move forward into the future, there is going to be a significant amount of money that's required for investment in refining those processes and procedures that are even more sustainable and not dependent on feedstock, etc. But in my mind, I believe that I think we've left it too late. We've been talking about global warming for many, many, many years, and now we decide to want to take action. But even then, it's taking an extremely long time to get anything executed of sustainable size at the end of the day. And so from an airline, I look at it and say, okay, what am I going to do in order to reduce my footprint? Yes, I can make an investment into new technology aircraft. As a matter of interest, the Boeing 747-8F, and this is not pushing Boeing, is the most modern freighter aircraft flying today. The 777F, which flies, was designed 10 years before the 747-8F. It's a 4-engine aircraft. It's got relatively modern engines, but for every flight hour that I do fly, I consume 10 tons of fuel. And each ton produces 3.15 tons of carbon. So that's the problem we face at the end of the day. However, if I have to start supplementing normal jet kerosene with a blended rate, I think the maximum blend we can take up to now is 50% SAF blended with 50% jet kerosene, and we can fly that on a sustainable basis. I'm still emitting carbon emissions. So it's an iterative process that you go through to get down to zero. But getting back to the main point is, how do we solve this problem of getting sufficient quantities of sustainable aviation fuel onto the market so that these premiums that we are currently paying now do not make it unaffordable for airlines? And the biggest question is, who is going to pay for this? We know it is going to be more expensive, but who is going to pay for this? Is it going to be the airline? Is it going to be the forwarder? In our instance, we only fly freight, we don't fly passengers. Or is it going to be the shipper? And I can tell you there are a variety of responses. We've been talking to our customers. Some are very enthusiastic about this. They are prepared to say, okay, my company has set aside X 100 million euros over the next 10 years to help. It's something, but it's a drop in the ocean. Okay, other forwarders are worried about the price because of the kinds of products that they transport into the market. It cannot take that additional premium that they have to pay, and others are still waking up to this whole concept. We talk about all of the current systems we have in place today, the EU ETS, we have the UK ETS, we have the Swiss ETS, we have Corsia coming along. And those are all on the ETS side. Does it really reduce carbon? Not really. You pay for it, that's it. It costs you money and you build it into the price of your product. In terms of Corsia, it's offsetting. So you're going to be buying a mango plantation somewhere in Mexico. It qualifies under ICAO rules and say it reduces carbon. Other parties have gone and said, I'm planting 1 million trees. Okay, 1 million trees, you've got to wait 30 years before it starts absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. It's not an immediate solution. The immediate solution is to use SAF. And unfortunately for the types of services we fly, long haul, wide-body aircraft, SAF at this stage is the only solution. Yes, we are currently in the process of evaluating the new technology freighters that are coming out now, and yes, they will reduce the amount of fuel we consume, period. Because it's to an engine, it's smaller aircraft, etc. And with the technology improvements, we don't burn as much fuel, but we are still emitting carbon at the end of the day. But the more important thing is that everybody that's been crying out about global warming, the biggest thing is, number one, as you said, the availability. And that's going to take, I think, more than $1 trillion to get the infrastructure up and running. And with all the investment that's going to be required to do your research and development. But more importantly, everybody crying out now for, hey, let's cut carbon emissions, etc. There is a cost that they're going to incur on a personal basis. When you go into a store now to buy something, it's going to cost you more. And then what happens? Inflation goes up, and then they complain about inflation and how are we going to support and make things more affordable at the end of the day. And that's the big conundrum at the end. I think as businesses, we understand the rationale to eliminate carbon emissions. But from a consumer perspective, I think they're still being very naive to say, yes, we want all of this, and at the end of the day, we still want to have the purchasing power that we had before. They are not prepared to simplify their lives to say, I don't need these things, therefore I don't need it to be transported. Yes, it's going to have a negative impact on my business at the end of the day, but what's more important, saving this planet or saving an individual business at the end of the day? Because without the planet, guys, we are not going to be in business.
I think we'll all agree with that last point. Alexandre.
Well, thanks a lot. Well, at Safran, we share our part too, because we do provide today through our subsidiary CFM around 70% of engines that fly on narrow bodies, be it Airbus or Boeing 737. And well, whenever we speak about, I think we all committed to this net zero aviation initiative here in the room. And whenever I speak to this initiative to, well, my family, my friends, people in the street, or even the media, they would, focus on science fiction, like flying whales, like flying wings, or nuclear aircraft, or full electric jumbo. And actually, the beauty of his roundtable is that it bring the proof that it's not about science fiction. If we were to plug a pipe of SAF on every single aircraft taking off today from Riyadh Airport, we would diminish by 50% their CO2 emission, just like that. So it's not about science fiction, it exists today. And yet the mystery of it is that I think SAF do represent something like 0.05% of the fuel burned by the commercial aviation today. Why is that? It's quite simple, and I think you put it very very clearly in your previous speech. It's not used because it's very expensive. It's 3 to 4 times as expensive as kerosene. It's not produced because it's not used, and it's expensive because it's not produced. And it's, I'm afraid, as simple as that. So how do we break this vicious cycle? How do we solve this chicken and egg kind of situation, where we are in a situation where we could actually tomorrow or even today diminish by 50% the CO2 emission of all aircraft flying in the world, not only 9-seaters, not only narrow bodies, but all your jumbo jets flying, all long-haul flights taking off from anywhere in the world with quite an easy solution. And yet it's not being used. I think we need 3 things. Well, first of all, definitely we need investments. And we need the industry to ramp up the capacity to produce in massive way this sustainable aviation fuel. If we make a very rough estimate of what it would cost to provide half of the 500 million tons of fuel that are needed by the commercial aviation, we speak about an investment of around 2,000 billion euros or dollars in the next 20 years. Well, it looks big, but I'd love our friends from Saudi Aramco to tell us about what is the capex prospect of the oil industry in the next 20 years. I think honestly it's quite reachable. Second, we need new technology, that's for sure, because at the end of the day it's going to be more expensive. And we all know that it's going to be more expensive, probably not 3 to 4 times more, but well, let's dream of a world where it will be 1.5 times more expensive. And the resource, at least for the biomass fuel, is limited as well. When we speak about, and you said it very rightly, when we speak about e-kerosene, e-SAF, well, then the electricity resource, the green electricity resource is going to be limited. Well, by the way, a nuclear power plant is much, much smaller than a Manhattan full of solar panels, but that's another discussion. That's another discussion. So we need to bring to the market technology that will bring the consumption down by at least 20, 25, 30%. And we do believe that it's feasible before 2030, 2035, let's say. And we even do believe that if you add the ATC problematic, you could bring down consumption by, well, up to 40% within the next 10 to 15 years. That's a huge gap. And it's feasible, technologically speaking. And the third thing, and that might be my answer, and I hate to say that to the questions you raised at the end of your intervention, the third thing we need is regulation. I agree with you. I mean, nobody wants to pay more, and customers will be individual travelers or freight customers. They don't want to pay more. So if we don't come up with regulation incentives that will slowly bring a blending mandate that is as ambitious as possible, let's say 10% in 2030, it's achievable. It's feasible. Some countries have even committed to 15 or 20%. In the US, they're going to do it. In the UK, they're going to do it. In the EU, we are at 6, 7, but the ambition could be raised to 10%. Elsewhere in the world, it's also something that most people have in mind. But if we don't bring these regulations that established on a given market, which will have to be big enough, like US domestic market, like European domestic market, a level playing field, whereby everybody will be submitted to the same constraint or to the same mandate, then I think we won't break this vicious circle I was mentioning before. And the conclusion of this is that, well, we need to bring everybody around the table and to think about concrete solutions. And that's actually what we're trying to do at Safran within the EU. We've launched months ago an industrial alliance in Brussels that brings together already 30 actors, Rolls-Royce being one of them, Airbus, Neste, major airlines like Lufthansa, like Air France-KLM, like Ryanair, governments official, that will start working from this summer on how do we come together to come with solutions that would link these three issues, which are production capacity, technology, and at the end of the day, the final consumer, which means probably more governmental regulation.
Great. Well, we've just had 4 of us who are directly or indirectly in the business of consuming fuel talk about the supply problems. Perhaps we might ask those who supply it to talk about the supply problems. And before I do, one other item where demand exceeds supply is clickers. So I'm going to hand this to you because I understand you've got some pages.
Go over here some slides and then...
there you go. Just continue to move through these.
Okay. Yeah, I will take the first go on this. As I guess today I will have a double hat. I'm here on behalf of Saudi Aramco, but also I'm one of the experts working at the ICAO Corsia Fuel Task Group, but also the long-term aspirational goal in support of the Kingdom Ministry and also the GACA. So I can give some flavor on the policy side of things. So I get that the picture that people have seen before, and I'll show it also in a different format. So basically what you're looking at is a trajectory in terms of the international aviation emissions. And as part of the Corsia framework, the aspiration is to get to neutral growth of 2019 onward, up to 2035, if I recall. And also more recently, there was a work concluded by ICAO on the long-term aspirational goal, how to get to net zero. And there's different things you can do here. If I recall the figure, in the blue part, you have all the improvement you can do from the technology side, which is an important part, work on the body of the aircraft, the engine of the aircraft, but the materials also. A lot of different technologies can really support that. You can also improve the operations, better routes, better less taxi time before landing, can help and support. But still, it's not enough. You need to have fuels, and you need to have different type of fuels. An important one is SAF, will play a major role. And as a teaser, I will show you at the end one of the reports from the long-term aspirational goal on the role of SAF. But SAF has limitation. We talk about them: the cost, availability, need for additional feedstocks. So we need to look into an holistic approach. We need to look at other type of fuels, of novel fuels. We talk about synthetic fuel as one. We know in the long, long run we can talk about electrification and hydrogen, but we know there is decades to come before we get there. But also as an industry, the oil and gas industry, the fuel producer, we have our role to play. And so as a teaser again, you see there is some hashed line that represent how our decarbonization can support the industry. We can further decarbonize the supply chain, the existing supply chain, as the SAF are taking off. Because we cannot just wait, we need to act on all the front right now. And so for CORSIA, you have a basket of measures, you have offsets, you have SAF, but also there's a new one. I mean, it's not a new, it's been a couple of years now, but you have also the lower carbon aviation fuel. And that's the one where it's about how can we further decarbonize the supply chain? Because also this can benefit the overall emission reduction. We need really to take a holistic approach. There is no silver bullet. And so for people who are not familiar with for the fuel producing, it's not just the use of it. You have to produce a crude oil, you have to transport it to the refinery, you have to refine it to jet fuel, and you have also to distribute it. And there's things we can do, there's levers we can use to further decarbonize that part of the supply chain. And we should be incentivized to do so, to support the overall industry and to try to solve the same problem we all have. We need to reduce those emissions. So there has been a couple of publications for people really to keep something in mind today, is that every jet fuel is not the same. There's a wide spectrum in terms of the carbon footprint or carbon intensity of the life cycle of the jet fuel. One component of it is a crude oil. I mean, people may know about the oil sands, so if there's anyone from Canada, I'm not picking on anyone, but we know that due to the oil sands, the extraction of it, there's a lot of emissions to produce it. That's a high end of the curve. So there's things that can be done also in terms of no routine flaring, minimizing venting that can help and contribute to reducing the supply chain. Another element is a refinery. Sorry if I don't spend too much time on the figures and slide. All of that is public, so please feel free to look at the publications. But overall, similar work can be done at a refinery. Carbon capture and sequestration is a solution. Integration of renewable sources for the utilities is another one, and also the use of low carbon hydrogen. So all of that can really help contributing to reducing the existing supply chain and the production of lower carbon aviation fuel. But it's not just that. We are also I will let Tamur explain on this. We're also looking at the SAF and the synthetic fuel because we do understand the limitation. Because at the end of the day, the combustion component, until we get to the direct air capture, cannot be solved from our side, from the supply chain side. It's really about the end use. And so we know that where the SAF is interesting is in terms of the biogenic sources of the CO2 that can really help reducing that down. As an example, EFA, in this example, I think it was 72% reduction. But you also do need to understand that it does take more energy and emissions and will produce more emissions to collect and harvest those feedstocks. So that you really need to look into the whole life cycle analysis. And then also eventually you have the e-fuels, but we know that this one is really about getting this power out. Maybe Zamur, if you want to add on this.
Okay. And thank you for doing the slides, because when we were going this way, I was thinking of doing a nomenclature first, because there's a lot of nomenclature here. So we've heard about bio-based SAFs. These are, for example, on this slide, it's HEFA. These are commercial scale processes that are available and being supplied as mentioned before, and it's typically used in the industry. So maybe what I want to focus today on is what you call the e-fuels, synthetic aviation fuels, sustainable aviation fuels. People also call them power to liquid, power to X. There's a bunch of nomenclature there, but for sake of this discussion, let's call them e-fuels or e-jets. So I want to start with the good news first. Good news is technologically or technically, these are viable pathways. So the way E-jets are produced or E-fuels are produced is you combine carbon dioxide and hydrogen through typical chemical processes which are established in the industry for decades. So specifically for aviation application, which is the E-jet pathway, you start by combining carbon dioxide and hydrogen to produce syngas, which is then converted using Fischer-Tropsch process to distillates, including diesel and jet. And these jet fuels are already certified through the ASTM standard, ASTM D7566, if I'm not wrong. They are already certified in there as a viable fuels to be used in engine, as one of our panelists was mentioning before. They are, I think you guys are targeting 100% blends, but I think the standards put it at 50% currently. So technically they are feasible, viable. The processes needed upstream of the synthesis plant involves green hydrogen production, and I think we are all aware there has been tremendous progress in renewable electricity production and also water electrolysis production. Again, both of these are commercially available units. Then you need a source for CO2. Now CO2 can be sourced through concentrated sources, through capture of CO2 from your flue gases to power plant, cement industry, associated gases through industrial processes. Again, the good news is these processes are also industrially available, commercially available. And finally, there's evolving source for CO2, which is direct air capture, which literally means to strip CO2 out of the atmosphere and use it for the synthesis process or as a source of CO2. That DAC process, or the direct air capture, as you call it, is currently evolving, and hopefully in next few years should also be available at scale to be used for such value chains. So overall, if I combine all of this, introduction or framing, the good news is these value chains, e-fuel or e-jet value chain, is technically viable. Also, we talked about carbon intensity reduction potential, as Jesse showed on this slide. Is first of all, these carbon intensity reduction are highly auditable. Yeah, so here you are using CO2 as a part of your synthesis process, so you literally can verify how much CO2 you are consuming and how much you are burning. So these are highly auditable processes, also enabling significant reduction in carbon intensity. I think this slide put it at around 90%, and these are the numbers that our analysis suggests we can achieve. We talked about, I think we heard parallels with Manhattan kind of area that is needed, that was mentioned. So I just wanted to say a couple of words on scalability. Scalability for these pathways, e-fuel pathways, requires renewable energy, right? But the good news again here is these are much more scalable than your agriculture-based biofuels. There's orders of magnitude more scalable compared to biofuel pathways, where the limitation is your agricultural yield per hectare or per acre of your land. And there's this agricultural limitation on that. Similarly, in terms of sustainability, water usage, here again, we're talking about orders of magnitude lower consumption of water and other primary resources for production of such fuels. So again, summing it up, the good news is these are technically viable to achieve your sustainability goals. Now, a couple of challenges, I think as we heard before, it's really a commercial challenge, right? So these are going to be expensive compared to your fossil jet fuels, right? So our analysis suggests that if you produce these fuels in regions where you have favorable renewable energy features, such as the place here in Saudi or the MENA region and South Europe, Australia is another example, South America, specifically Chile. These are the places where you have higher what you call renewable energy utilization factors available. So in these regions, you can reduce the intermittency cost of renewable energy and hence reduce your overall cost for green hydrogen that is required to produce these fuels. And again, our analysis suggests that in regions where you have favorable geography in terms of renewable energy features, you can produce these fuels quite competitive to your typical HEFA-based or advanced bio-based, used cooking oil-based biofuels. So, but still, this commercial challenge still remains, as these are more expensive than your traditional jet fuels. Finally, I think another challenge is we talk, I think some of the panelists also touched on this, is there has to be a clear-cut, carbon accounting policies and also blending kind of mandates that can drive let's say, the uptake of some of these advanced value chains such as e-fuels. Now, to improve the technological readiness and also commercial and other aspects of these value chain, Saudi Aramco is investing significant R&D efforts. I'm part of an R&D organization where we are developing an e-fuel or e-jet demonstration plant together with our partner Repsol in Spain. This is south of Europe, again utilizing the favorable renewable energy features where we'll produce synthetic jet fuels. Also, as a complementary project, which may not be as relevant to today's topic of discussion, which is aviation today, but we are also investing similar R&D efforts to produce e-fuels or power to liquid fuel for other sectors such as road and heavy duty road, light duty and heavy duty road transport. So we believe there is a potential for these fuels, and given the right market conditions, these fuels could be further upscale, or the production capacities could be further upscale.
Great.
If
We've
I
got
may-
about, sorry.
Just to add on this, because I think it will help on the next part of the question, because the question was how do we get there, and it will be a step approach. And so just wanted to share that it's from the long-term aspirational goal report from ICAO. That's one of the scenarios, the integrated scenario number 2, that shows their view of the 200 experts working on that discussion of the fuels. What will be the landscape for the fuels? And so we see that there will be an important uptake of SAF. That's a major contributor. But we see that there is also the PTL or the e-fuels, or depending who you ask, I guess the name, that will be part of it, important part of it. And then also eventually the LCAF. So it's really a step approach. It's about considering the availability of the feedstock, about considering the cost of those, as also a lot of R&D is put into the novel fuel that will help overall trying to solve this issue.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we've covered a broad landscape of the questions that I might have asked. I've got 3 things that I wanted to probe on more deeply. We've got about 12 minutes left, so I'm looking for sort of soundbite answers, and I'll distribute them across our panelists. I think the first one is the question of cost. So several of you have said that the industry can't sustain a cost premium of 3x and that consumers won't be willing to pay for it. Of course, that's a soundbite, the 3x number, that came from fuel prices in 2019. As we stand today, Jet A prices over the last few weeks have variably been in the range of 2.5 to 3.5 times what they were in 2019. And so far, the industry has seen virtually zero demand destruction. And so is that a signal that consumers are, if they have to, more willing to pay than we might think? And is there a role for government to play in sort of smoothing things out? We could just stand and say, this is the price for jet, and we're going to hold it here, until we backfill with new technologies. Yeah, sure. And let me first direct that to Richard, quick reaction, and then Alexandre.
Okay, I think the reason why the people have continued to travel and goods have continued to be transported with the surcharges we charge for the increase in fuel is because we are in an extraordinary situation where people have not been allowed to travel for two years. They've been locked up, etc. And now there's an explosion of demand. But it's not going to last, not at these prices that they're currently paying for tickets.
Okay.
Likewise, in the cargo community, while the rates to transport are way higher than ever experienced before, the fuel element seems to be a lot smaller. But once normalcy returns, then it's going to have your impact.
Alexandre, would Safran have the same view?
Yeah, well, I think we have to face it. Low carbon economy will be more expensive, at least on the medium term, than our economy is. And, well, nobody wants to pay 2 million euros to get isolation on its building with a ROI of 20 years or 30 years. That's the case. Nobody wants to pay 30% more for an electric car with an autonomy of 200 kilometers when you can drive your usual Renault or Mercedes. And, well, yet you have to, because you have regulations. By 2035, you will have to drive electric car in the whole Europe. Beginning from this year, you can't sell your apartment if it's not a A-based apartment. So you have to invest, and there is no option. The problem we're facing with aviation is not a question of technology, is why don't we trust the technology the same way we do trust the technology on cars or on buildings? And I think one of the answer is lays in the mix up between technological feasibility, and I think we all agree here to say that yes, it's feasible, and not for 50 years from now, but for tomorrow, and the global acceptance or the social acceptance of flying. Actually, flying is very much perceived as, not useful or a pleasure for the rich people, or not as useful as heating your building at your apartment at 20 degrees, and yet we could survive with 12 degrees, or driving your car to work. And I think that's this kind of message that we should focus on too.
Yep.
Actually, why is mobility, global mobility, as useful today as it is to get heating in your apartment and or to drive your car to work, and that the mix-up between the two aspects is a real hindrance today when it comes to investments and to regulations.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good point. I think that as an industry, we have very quickly accepted the label of environmental criminal.
Yeah,
despite
absolutely.
the fact that we are 2.5% or so of global emissions.
Yeah.
A very quick question, or hopefully a question with a very quick answer. You mentioned that Rolls-Royce is vigorously testing existing turbofan technology to make sure that it can run off of SAF. Of course, in aviation, we have to test everything. We have zero tolerance for mistakes. But from a technology standpoint, in a world where jet engines can run on any combustible liquid, do we expect there to be any reason why the answer should not be 100%?
No.
No.
Simple answer.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And then the last question, and I'll touch on a couple of you, but several of you have pointed to technologies that require green, inexpensive, scalable electricity as the end solution.
Yes.
And so that is true of power to liquids. By the way, it is also true if we want to use pure hydrogen, that hydrogen has to come from somewhere, and if it's going to be green, it's come through renewable electricity. We don't hear a lot about investments in that. And what are some of the pathways to solve that problem? Start with you, JK.
As my last answer was so short, I'll take this one.
Okay.
I actually think there are some fantastic examples of technologies that can enable us to break today's vicious cycle. We're stuck at the moment because we don't have enough supply. We all want to chase it. We're driving the price up. Okay, so break the cycle. If we can find a way to greater scalability that doesn't compete with feedstocks, then we can break this cycle. And there are some really good examples. In this part of the world, we could talk about solar to SAF. It would be a great opportunity. For us, something that could be an even better game changer is Rolls-Royce has developed small modular reactors, so nuclear technology, but away from some of the downsides of nuclear. So small, scalable, can be delivered to site, can be built in a modular fashion. This would be a fantastic way to give you sustainable, high capability power instantly to generate SAF, e-fuels, and drive that price point down. To me, that's a really, really good example of how we get to a virtuous cycle. And then allied to my last answer, and to pick up Alexandra's point, if we're at 100% blend, actually aviation is then really at the net zero point alongside some of these timescales.
Yep. Well, that certainly sounds easier than painting all of Manhattan with solar panels. Maybe the last answer on this front, I'll reach out to Tamur and JC, but the world is looking for countries and locations to take the lead on this. And certainly as an outsider, we look at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and say there's no other country in the world that would have greater motivation to find a solution to replace petroleum-based fuels. You've got favorable geography, as you said, and you also have a policy-making mechanism that is capable and shows a track record of establishing very bold visions and targets and making things happen. Is the kingdom ready to take a real lead, particularly in e-fuels, where, as you said, this is the most scalable technology that we see? It's one that requires a bit of long-term thinking, but we see all of the ingredients.
I think, as I mentioned to you, is that I can answer for Aramco. I think we as Aramco R&D, we are investing significant efforts and resources to make it a commercial reality. But as I mentioned, there are some challenges that has to be overcome before, as we move towards commercialization or deployment of these value chains, as I call them, at mass scale or commercial scale. But certainly there is enabling infrastructure, not only in terms of renewable energy that is available in the kingdom, but also, leadership in moving energy products over the geographies and just the general know-how of operating chemical facilities that at the end of the day, chemical plants. So I think all of them combined, it provides a good, let's say, launching pad to commercialize these value chains.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think that does bring us to the end of our time. I think I speak on the behalf of all of our panelists that as we de-mic, we're available for any questions that you might have sort of one-to-one. But I'd like to thank our panelists, a very productive discussion, a surprising amount of alignment, and I think alignment is actually the single most important ingredient that we need to come to over the course of the next months and years. With that alignment comes a focusing of our efforts, a focusing of our investments, and the ability to tell a common story to the world about how we're going to get to the goals that we've set for ourselves. So thank you very much for your time, your thoughts, your expertise, and thank you for your attention over the course of the last 50 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.